thanks to Canon Collins for their support through the years. It's been such an honor to be associated with the trust, and to see how it has flourished in leaps and bounds through the years. Julian will tell you a little bit more about it later on. And of course also the Ford Foundation for once again allowing us this space. So I just give you a brief overview of my presentation. You will see that I will talk about a very abbreviated autobiographical reflection of my coming to feminist consciousness. We'll then go on to talk about some theoretical and methodological sensibilities that have informed my scholarship about women leading for social justice. And then to quickly just reflect on some of my work, my research that I've done over the years, and this has been done in collaboration with my postgraduate students as well. So, I mean, the title of the movie is Hidden Figures, and it's a nice play on words in the sense that your hidden figure as a persona, as a person, but also the hidden figures in terms of the cost, the emotional cost, the psychic cost, that is associated with marginalization and disenfranchisement and stuff. So I'm going to move on. I try not to break down and cry, but I wanted to read for you. I said, so we watched the movie The Hidden Figures, and let us quickly acquaint ourselves with the other few hidden or forgotten figures. Forgotten are the mothers, the enslaved women whose bodies were sacrificed for the advancements of gynecological research. If you were to stroll through New York Central Park, you may see a statue of Dr. James Marion Sims. That's the gentleman there on the left, with his decoration. Please note all his medals as well. And he is acclaimed as the father of American gynecology. The modern-day speculum, which is used in gynecological examination, is largely credited to Dr. Simmons. Between 1845 and 1849, his gynecological experiments were conducted on slave women, who in many cases he purchased and kept as property at the back of his private hospital for women in Montgomery, Alabama. Sims left behind a few medical advances and inventions, one of them being the vaginal speculum. So while the design has been refined, the modern-day speculum is like the one Sims used on his captive patients. The idea of the speculum came to Sims while treating a white patient who had been thrown from a horse. After he helped her reposition her uterus, he had an idea. He fetched a slave, had her lay on her back with her legs up, and inserted the blunt handle of a silver gravy spoon into a vagina. He performed many of his experimental procedures without anesthesia. Some of these slave women were operated on up to 30 times. He reasoned that slave women were able to bear great pain because their race made them more durable. Thus, they were well suited for medical experimentation. Although concerns were raised about the ethics of his experiments, Sims was allowed to continue using slave women as guinea pigs for his unproven surgical theories. Okay, so here, these are hidden figures as well, the hidden mothers, and the guys that we celebrate and actually put up monuments in our parks and stuff. And perhaps we could talk about that later in relation to the Rhodes Must Fall enterprise and project as well. So what about the other women that are underrepresented? Those, for example, in, I don't have that one here, but I meant to show you the figures for, let me just rather read it. So what about the underrepresentation of women in management positions at the top of South African universities? There was a table here that I meant to show you that at South Africa's top 9 universities, 8 vice-chancellors and principals are male, and there is only one university that has a female vice-chancellor. And despite having the highest student enrollments, her salary is almost 50% less than the highest earning vice-chancellor. So just to give you a sense, the highest earning vice-chancellor, who is a male, earns an average of 4.2 million rands per annum, whereas the female, the only one, earns 2.2 million per annum. So huge disparities in terms of those hidden figures. Okay. Let us also not forget the Me Too campaign that has now started off. So, and also the 16 days of activism. All of these are just once again drawing attention to women's marginalized status, disenfranchisement in society. There are far too many and too many numerous examples for me to showcase the recurring narrative of invisibility, inequity that women actually have to endure in society, and is against this historical and current backdrop that the agitation for gender equality and championing the cause of the marginalized rights have been taken up with rigor within feminist discourses. So feminist discourses and theories, I'm going to try to manage both of this, so please bear with me, okay? And I'm not too good at this, but I'm going to try. Okay, so feminist theories and perspectives attempt to describe women's oppression, explain its causes and consequences, and strategize towards women's liberation. As feminism diversifies, a multiplicity of feminist identities continue to emerge by virtue of intersectionality. For example, we have African feminism, Pan-African feminism, Christian feminism, humanist feminism, Muslim feminism, eco-feminism, lean-in feminism, black feminism, Latino feminism. Feminists disagree about what sexism consists in and what exactly ought to be done about it. They disagree about what it means to be a woman or a man and what social and political implications gender has or should have. Nonetheless, motivated by the quest for social justice, feminist inquiry provides a wide range of perspectives on social, cultural, economic, and political phenomena. Important topics for feminist theory and politics include the body, socioeconomic class and work, disability, the family, colonialism, globalization, human rights, popular culture, race and racism, reproduction, science, the self, sex work, human trafficking, and sexuality. And prevailing trends point to new feminisms emerging, which are more reflective of the different cultural, psychological, and material concerns of new generations of women, and they highlight the interlocking systems of oppression. Each feminist strand, however, provides a partial and tentative resolution to the women questions by offering a fresh perspective with its own methodological merits and demerits. So I'm going to move on and just talk a little bit about my own autobiographical reflection. I'll read a little bit, and please stop and put your hand up and say something if you need to. So my own autobiographical reflection on coming to feminist consciousness actually happened quite late in my academic pursuits, largely through the medium of reading and experiencing the injustices committed against women in the workplace. Hailing from a home background that showed no disturbing espousals, either in its gendered expectation of behavior or division of labor, the overt and covert impulses of patriarchal culture were not immediately apparent to me. With mom and dad working outside home, operating a small informal business, on returning home in the evenings, they would continue their partnership cooking, cleaning, and scouring, not discriminating or differentiating between gender-prescribed roles or responsibilities. Growing up in a racially divided South Africa, however, meant that the social disparities and prejudices in terms of color, language, and geographical apartheid did not correlate with the philosophy of love, unity and respect for humanity that my parents and pastors preached about. The often quoted biblical scripture, "For God so loved that he gave," despite coming under fire for its generic portrayal of the Godhead, carried the essence of caring and sharing which transcended color, creed, race, or culture. This, coupled with the injunction to love my neighbor as myself, often took on the form of almsgiving to the indigent in my neighborhood. Thus, I have recollections of being steeped in humanitarian activism, largely by virtue of us enjoying comparatively more privileged economic capital than most of our neighbors. I recalled that this was rendered more possible at some times than others, largely to our family vacillating between lower and middle class strata at different periods during my growing up. So given the harmonious gender relations of mutual caring and consideration that prevailed in my home, where lingering conversations around the dinner table provided a place for freedom of expression, the discourse on feminism or gender discrimination was irrelevant to my experiential realities. In retrospect, I realized that being a beneficiary of horizontally privileged gender relations and a safe home environment insulated, blinded, and made me oblivious to the dehumanization that others suffered at the hands of patriarchy. With the odd exception, I naively assumed that my sheltered and protected lifestyle was normative. Now I recall with a flush of embarrassment my disassociation from feminism, preferring rather being remembered as a humanitarian activist. So with my femininity safely intact, like a dutiful daughter, I studied the long-received wisdom of the fathers and, armed with my identity papers, ventured into the education profession, resolute to make teaching a subversive activity. Nothing in the campus crusades of the 1980s prepared me for the roller coaster emotional ride that my entrance into the labor market would present me with. It was here that I personally encountered the potency of patriarchal oppression. Sharing the disillusionment and frustrations of those female educators who did not aid and abet patriarchal precepts and postures, it was as a teacher of English that I experienced the full impact of being a victim of gender discrimination. Management structures, more often than not occupied predominantly by men, given to exaggerated power performances, pedagogical apparatuses and rituals that excluded, trivialized, stereotyped, or denigrated female realities, all served to marginalize the female school population, perpetuate gender discrimination, and ensure our continued subordination. Assailed by such stultifying practices, it was only upon quieter reflection, heightened inquiry into gender concerns, and critical maturation that the feminist light sensitized me to the pervasiveness of patriarchal deception. So there is a naturalized, taken for granted acceptance that education is a good thing. Little, if any, attention is given to the ways in which educational institutions serve as fortresses that incubate and reproduce race, class, gender, linguistic, and other forms of discrimination, exclusion, and symbolic violence. Thus, as an educationist, I became particularly sensitive to discriminatory systems of educational practices, policies, and procedures that promote social injustice and inequalities. My exposure to the work of Paulo Freire, other critical and feminist theorists such as Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Antonia Dada, Patty Lather, Michael Apple, gave me a vocabulary to articulate, theorize, and respond to the injustices perpetuated through social structures and institutions such as religious institutions, work sites, schools, etc. All education is political, either educating to support and maintain the status quo or helping to critique and change reality. So I just want to come back to some of my slides and just talk a little bit to this here. So I did my master's at the University of Cape Town, and my dissertation was entitled A Feminist Critique of Language. And through this study, some of the things that really emanated was that English language in particular, and other languages which I don't want to talk about since I'm not too au fait with it, but language is actually a man-made construct, and it helps to engineer, it engineers by dividing the world into two unequal parts, and it elevates the first category and devalues the second category. For example, if we look at the binary man and woman, mind and body, black and white, rational and irrational, these are constructs that divide the world into two unequal parts, elevating the first category and devaluing the second category. So in terms of gender, we talk about, you know, men's status in society in relation to women. I want to just mention, talk a little bit about the mind-body split, and we see that education has a tendency to privilege the mind, the rationality. Very little consideration is given for the body, and yet we show up with our bodies, and it is our bodies that is our first identity marker. I'll share just one little snippet of data from my research, where one of my participants was a young black female lecturer at the University of the Free State. And she taught a class that was predominantly male Afrikaner, and she was teaching English literature to them. So she wanted to, you know, subscribe to feminist theories of Paulo Freirean dialogue. You know, we are in conversation with each other. There isn't a hierarchy between the teacher and the learner. We are here mutually as co-learners. And when she tried to adopt that pedagogical style, it was met with much disconcertation and skepticism, because her students thought that here it is, she's asking us to tell us what we think because she doesn't know her stuff. Okay, so her body became equated with deficit, her physical body. Okay, and so she talks about how that she had to change her teaching strategy. So now she had to come in with a body of authority, both in terms of her physical body, but also in terms of her body of knowledge. You understand? So she had to rethink her philosophy based on that, so that she does not get construed as somebody who is now dependent on the intellectual, capital of her students in order to carry this class. Interesting stuff, right? And so she made an interesting critique about, you probably heard about servant leadership, all right? And she said that when I walk in as a black woman into this class, if I subscribe to servant leadership, it does nothing to dismantle this very stereotype, calcified thinking about black women, because in South African societies, black women and servants, you know, the whole domestication of labor and stuff like that, and she would just be perpetuating those stereotypes. So I want to bring that to you, because later on I'll just talk a little bit about how, you know, we're talking about the fees must fall, we're talking about the decolonization of education, and decolonization does not only have to do with territorial regain and land reclaim, but also in terms of ideologies, viewpoints, and how people are actually have been cast on this landscape. So how do we dismantle that particular the imagery and identities that have already been cast for us? Okay, I'm going off script because I have a paper. You know, I'm an academic, all right. So anyway, so here, and I think we mentioned this here as well. Some of the research activities, my PhD I did at the University of Witwatersrand. Nicolette also mentioned that it was entitled Enacting Feminisms in Academia. And here, the questions that I posed here is, who is the teacher and who are her students? Once again, comes back to our decolonization debates about identities. You know, very important is that we need to be sensitive to the politics of difference, diversity, and intersectionality in education contexts, as they are characterized by multicultural, multilingual, multi-faith, and diversity of experiential realities. So the questions about who is the teacher and who are we and who are our students relate to acknowledging the identities and biographies of educators and students, which is what Kotso was saying as well in her comment. It refers to the nature of the relationship between the educator and her students and significant others in this pedagogic relationship. So, but what does she teach? And this question gestures to the matters that favor knowledges and knowledge-scapes. So you'll notice the plural, knowledges and knowledge-scapes, right? It is skeptical of claims to single regimes of truth and is biased towards multiple perspectives that acknowledge the incompleteness, the partiality, and the fluidity of knowledge claims. questions that we want to ask in terms of what, because this is about decolonizing the curriculum, is whose knowledge is this? Whose curriculum is this? How did it become official? Who sanctioned and endorsed this? If we go back to the James Marion Sims legacy, if we were to read about him in most of our textbooks, he will be glorified, celebrated, valorized, and all of his medals would once again be put on place. But the hidden stories behind that, remain hidden. So how did it become official? What is the relationship between this knowledge and the ways in which it is taught and evaluated, and who has cultural, social, and economic capital in this society? Who benefits from these definitions of legitimate knowledge and from the ways of schooling and society and the way schooling and society is organized? Who does not benefit from it? So who is brought into the centrality of it, and then who remains on the periphery or completely erased? All right. And how do we usually see as reforms? How do what are usually seen as reforms actually work? And how can we, as critical educators, researchers, and activists, change existing educational and social inequalities in order to create curricula and teaching that are more socially just? And then, of course, we ask the question: why does a feminist teacher choose to impart the kind of knowledge that she does? And feminist pedagogy, feminist discourse, has actually been described as a conversionist discourse. It means that it wants to effect a conceptual and ideological shift in the way our students, ourselves, how we see the world, how we are in the world, and that we do not accept as taken for granted and conclusive the regimes of truth that have been passed down to us. Okay, so it is a conversionist discourse. It does want to make a shift in the world. And then where does this teaching take place? The context. So teaching is not just about the content, but it's also about the context. Okay, and I like what I saw the other day. It was an interesting title with so just bear with me. So it's got CO open brackets N close brackets TEX. Do you see the co-text, but also the con? Who's conning who about the text? All right. Okay, so also, in terms of what are the myths that get perpetuated about where we come from, how we engage knowledge, whose knowledge we engage, and then when is she teaching, the time of day, the political economic climate within which she is teaching. And I go to school sometimes and watch our teachers teach economics, and they slavishly hold onto a book that was written by God knows where, when, and the economic realities of what's persisting and prevailing now is completely obscured, silenced, erased from the narrative. So the time, the dispensation in which we are teaching is important. And you can go to some schools and open up some textbooks, and you will see the first date of publication 1956 or 1946. And I don't have a problem with that, except that if you teach that as gospel without critiquing it, otherwise those texts that were written in those eras actually present wonderful pedagogic moments to teach critical thinking as well. And then, of course, how does she teach? These are the technologies of teaching that she used, her teaching styles and stuff like that. And then how does she assess what has been learned? And this has implications for multiple intelligences, different ways of knowing and seeing and doing that are often ignored in traditional assessment practices. Okay, and when I was at university, we studied a book by Postman and Weingartner, and they suggested that we do not just answer the questions, but that we question the answers and then question the questions, right? And these are politically laden questions which go to the very core of critical pedagogy. So I am very conscious of time. I'm going to move on to some of my work here, postdoctoral work. I talked about me receiving the Canon Collins scholarship as part of my PhD, and I'm very grateful for that. My postdoctoral research activities actually took me to the Center for Women's Education at the University of Michigan. And here is when I decided to combine my interest in critical feminist conceptions of language and curriculum with educational leadership. And once again, here you probably heard much about this, but how there's a tendency to equate leadership with men. It's very patriarchal. If you're not assertive, individualistic, and egotistical, then you don't quite qualify for leadership positions, okay? And without kind of like scripting feminist educational leadership as homogenous, I do want to say that for the most part, research is showing that women tend towards more collaborative, consultative leadership styles. I want to acknowledge as well that that women generally try to shy away from taking on leadership positions, mostly because they've been socialized to believe that they are just not born leaders. And yet they take on leadership roles in the in informal sectors, running a home, looking after kids, and all of that should not be looked upon lightly. I'll share one more piece of data from research that we did with in KwaZulu-Natal with one of our participants by the name of Bina Gomedi, and she actually makes traditional clay pots. She tells the story of how she says, "I am lazy." She says, because, when the rest of my brothers and sisters left home to come and work in Johannesburg, I decided to stay home, and then I got married, and then she had about 7 kids. And she talks about her husband leaving home to come and work in the mines as well. And then she says, but then she goes on to say that I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, I go to the hills to collect the clay, I come back, I get the kids ready, send them off to school, and then spends the whole day crafting these traditional clay pots. And she was totally oblivious about the private labor, and this goes back to Marxist theory in terms of work that is done in the public sphere and that is remunerated is the only visible labor, and that is acknowledged and stuff, and her invisible labor in the private sphere is denigrated, looked upon, and it shows once again her socialization to devalue the work that she did. All right, and I think this is stuff once again encouraging to look back at some of these theories that have come through from Western systems that do not necessarily resonate with our own realities here. And I think there's a lot of examples that I give you, but I just wanted to share that with you with regard to Bina Gomedi and her conception of what constituted hard work and labor. And feminist theories have been very vocal about emotional labor, okay, that and the management of emotional labor. It comes through very strongly in the work that I have done with refugee teachers, as well as women leading in disadvantaged communities, where it's not just the labor, the pedagogic labor of teaching, but the emotional labor of having to look after the very traumatic experiences that students and teachers experience as well. So my postdoctoral work actually took me into this area of educational leadership, and I'll just talk a little bit about what that, and I've mentioned it. But I know for Ntogo. Yeah, Ntogo was very interested in the feminist research methodologies, and feminist research methodologies are really invested in democratizing the research process by striving for non-hierarchical researcher-researched relations. And that means that as a researcher, if I come to work with you, and you my participant, that we are actually, nothing stops us from actually researching each other. In as much as I would ask you personal questions about, like Bina Gomedi, she disclosed so much of her personal stories. Nothing stops me from also sharing, and therefore I take you back to that gallery of honor that I ran, because for me, I think that is really important to talk about who it is that I am, who are the people that supported my work and my journey as well. So feminist research methodologies wants to break through the hierarchy, and it is not interested, and it cautions against a rape model of research that takes and rather than gives. And we know that, we say that we go and collect data from our participants and we take from them, but what do we give? We take it, and as academics and as scholars, we can go and write beautiful papers, we can present at conferences, we can get published, and we get all the accolades. But what do our participants get in return. Okay, so that is like cautioning us and making us maybe sensitive to how does this become a more reciprocal relation, and we do not see our participants as objects, as data objects, right? I want to move on. So some of the projects that I have been involved in is the Women Writing Africa project. This is a Ford Foundation funded project here, Nicolette, and it's once again, it's about the invisibility of women, the untold stories of women, and how we can once again excavate and redistribute this narrative field so that the experiences of women can become put out there into the mainstream. And the other project that I was involved in is how religion and culture impact girls and impact on girls' human rights. There's a tendency to see religion and culture in very glorified romantic terms. Some of us are very sentimental about our religion and about our culture, but under the fortress of religion and culture, how are girls' rights violated, marginalized, erased? Okay, give you one little example. I was reading this year in May. I was reading about, there's a cultural practice in Namibia. Please don't ask me to tell it to you in the local language, but it talks about when a male guest comes to a household, apart from the wife being expected to cook and clean and be very hospitable, she is also required to grant him sexual favors. And apparently that when there is a stick that is placed outside the bedroom door, the husband should know that his male friend is busy with the wife and should not disturb them. And apparently it's been debated in Parliament, and most of the male parliamentarians are very anti the abolishment of that particular cultural practice. Okay, some of the other work was that I will talk to you about is about critically leaderful schools, and the bigger project that I've been involved for in quite a while is women leading in disadvantaged education contexts. And this research has been conducted in Johannesburg, Pretoria, KwaZulu-Natal, the Eastern Cape, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and Kenya. And more recently, we've had students from Rwanda join the project as well. I think that Toko will talk to me a little bit about this. What I did want to, and I will close with these few things, just to say that some of the papers that have emanated from this here was the paper Responding with Hospitality, Refugee Children in the South African Education Context. And it just talks about their flight, their pre-flight, their flight, and their settlement experiences in South Africa. Very grueling, very haunting stories. And the interesting thing here is about how hospitality is also, within the word hospitality is the word hostile. Think about it, right? And this came through very poignantly in issues like just nutrition. So the work that I do with the school in Berea, they offer the children, the refugee children, who come to school from 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. So it's a project school. They don't go to the mainstream school day, and they offer them a meal in the afternoon. And I noticed that some of the children were not eating. It's a little sandwich. It's a little very shriveled up apple and a very sugary drink that they are given at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And sometimes this is the only meal that the children actually have for the whole day. I visited these kids in their home as well. It's overcrowded, over 9 people living in a 1-bedroom house room, and they wait to come to school. And then they get this little meal, and some of them don't eat it. And when I asked them about it, they said that if they eat it and then they go home without any food for the family, they will be reprimanded, and they will probably even get a beating. So we want to talk about the emotional labor that teachers have to bear, having to work with children who come from these communities. And I will read one poem. You must indulge me because I don't want to go without reading this to you. But just to talk about also that as much as the teachers in these schools, and there's a tendency to focus on teachers in relation to teachers' roles and responsibilities, seldom, if ever, do we hear about the rights of teachers. Think about it, right? And so my work is also focused on the teachers and their experiences, especially teachers that are teaching from foreign teachers who are refugee and migrant teachers that are living in South Africa and working part-time. And they talk about the trauma of their own experiences of having fled war-torn countries, and they've come here, and as teachers they have to manage their emotions. So despite their own trauma and despite their own, we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but what about continuing traumatic stress disorder? And these teachers have to kind of bury all of their trauma in order to come across as strong and helpful and supportive of the children. The one teacher talked about how she's married and her husband was just abusive throughout their entire marriage, and she is the head of a science department in school. And she says that after years and years and years of abuse, he decided to finally ask for a divorce. And they divorced, but he refused to move out of the house. And the trauma still continued, and the harassment continued. And one day she gets back home and she finds him that he's hanging from the ceiling. He commits suicide. So you talk about, we, as I said, the focus of my work has been, we will focus on the children, we will talk about their human rights, but let's not silence in this discussion the human rights of teachers. And one last narrative before I close. So some of the work that I've done is called the pedagogy of place, and how context and place impacts on who you are as a teacher. And the story that came through in this pedagogy of place was I went to visit a teacher who was a pre-service teacher, so he's still training to become a teacher. And he was teaching the novel Animal Farm. Now, that's a political satire, right? And throughout this entire thing, he just got the children, the students. It was, first of all, what was striking is that there were so few resources. They literally had photocopies of different pages of this novel, and they were sharing it and trying to read this novel. But anyway, so he taught this novel, and he got stuck on this phrase, the best human being is a dead human being. And he got the students to even repeat it, and I was just fixated about it. And I was just wondering, I thought at some point he will start to critique this thing, and he didn't. So in our post-teaching, post-lesson reflection, I asked him about it, and I said, this is a political satire, but you spoke about it and you talked about it in such a neutral kind of way, in such an apolitical kind of way. How is that possible? And he didn't quite answer the question, but he told me that he said that it's sometimes best in this particular context to teach in a neutral way, because he's a foreigner. He's from was it Zimbabwe or Mozambique? I forget. But in around about that time, there was an incident where one of the refugees was actually necklaced and burnt. I don't know if you remember. So he actually came from that area, and he said that he was afraid to teach in a politically incendiary way, because he felt that it would draw attention to himself and stuff. So he actually opted for a pedagogy of what we call epistemic avoidance. You avoid certain things because you are afraid to do that. So listen, can I read that poem? And then I will go. Okay, I wanted to read this because this is from one of the refugee children, one of the refugee singers that I picked up, and I thought I would share that with you because it kind of encapsulates much of the work that I have done and the experiences of the refugee children. So it says, I am a drifter, without a thing to call my own. War and hunger, the causes I leave my home. I seek asylum, a burden to my destination. Neglected, I feel like an AIDS patient. Education, instinct, and natural innovation. I'm not wasting a minute. I'm community hope adjunct, working labor. Your friendly, peaceful, networking neighbor. I'm teased about my accent, but my language will be greater. I'm your doctor. I am authorized to treat your pain. How come you trust me when I operate in your bleeding veins? Couldn't you see it when you asked when would I be leaving? Did you think my activities could only be refugeeing? So he says, I'm your daughter, because war isn't really my fault. I'm your son. Hunger isn't really my fault. We're your children. We know that politics fall. We forgive you. We won't hold grudges at all. And this is my world. This is my world. I'm a cleaner, a humble beginning for a natural leader. My son is caught up, he's doing crime and misdemeanors, and I'm a judge, a former refugee myself. I don't condone law breaking, but I know what's at stake, and I'm a poet. I offer you a piece of my mind. I clear obstacles with my optimal beats and rhymes. I'm an athlete. I absolutely have to have the fastest feet. I'm worth millions. A fired bullet couldn't match my speed. I'm an attorney. My journey has been most severe. But the human who's attacked will adapt and persevere. And those who'd rather wait tell me how you validate when our lives seem to waste beyond the gates you barricade. I'm African, and my arrival is no accident. From colonization to miseducation, my track is bent, so I'm here. Like my brother who got chained to a board, imagine if he and I meet, detained and chained for court. Okay, I'm white, yeah, I said it. That's right, I'm the reason why refugee agencies began their fight. I am a man-made problem. I didn't appear overnight. And while I exist in this world, you too will behold the plight. I'm Latino. See, me no speak good English. But if immigration gives me papers, I do big business. I'm Asian. I'm here with an ever-overwhelming population. I can't be defined by creed, race, let alone occupation. Okay, so I want to stop there. I know my time is up.